The California Bark Beetle Epidemic Policy Analysis Project, presented by Rebecca Ludowski, Jacob Seidel, Ian Wisher, and Jeffrey Stanhope. Bark beetle has become a serious cause of tree mortality on the western United States and specifically in California. This aerial footage is from a survey the Forest Service conducted in May 2016. Between 2010 to 2015, during the height of the bark beetle outbreak, the insect was responsible for the mortality of at least 66 million trees. This has led to increased fire potential and severity, leaving many communities and structures vulnerable. Tree mortality on such a large scale also means the loss of habitat for animals that require middle-aged or mature forests for a part of their life cycle. Fires started in stands with heavy mortality can also spread into healthy stands of trees, causing further tree mortality. Due to past land use history of intense logging, federal forests in California are mostly all of the same age. These types of forests become very susceptible to bark beetles as they reach maturity. Bark beetles rarely, if ever, attack trees younger than 60 years. Due to large-scale clear-cuts occurring until the 1960s throughout the West and California, many forests consist of these single-age forests. As the West was settled, many large parcels of land with virgin timber were sold off to private landowners and logged. In response to this, forested lands were put into reserves. In the 1940s, due to an increased demand for timber due to World War II, federal lands also began falling subject to large-scale clear-cuts because the private lands had been depleted at this point. In response to this, starting largely in the 1960s, Congress began passing acts to stop these unsustainable practices from continuing. Since logging pretty much halted on federal land concurrently, these acts have led to massive bark beetle outbreaks in national parks in California.
As you can see in these two maps, the forests most stressed by the drought are primarily federal forests. This is due to an extensive legislative history aimed at regulating timber harvesting on federal lands. As we mentioned earlier, due to past land use history, forests were transformed into even-aged stands that are now reaching an age where they are susceptible to beetle predation. These conditions, coupled with the onset of the drought within the West, has allowed the bark beetle epidemic to occur. Bark beetles are tiny beetles which make their living by feeding on the inner bark of trees. Bark beetles begin their life as eggs laid inside of tubes dug into the bark of their host tree. They hatch into larvae which spend the entire winter feeding on the inner bark of the host tree. This is the primary source of damage because as the larvae eat, they disrupt the tree's ability to transport nutrients. Before the larvae can do their damage, the adult beetles must lay eggs in the bark. Gaining access to the tree is not an easy task for an individual beetle, as trees have the ability to defend themselves by drowning the beetles in their pitch-filled sap. To overcome these defenses, bark beetles use aggregation pheromones which call all nearby beetles to attack simultaneously. To further weaken the tree, the beetles infect the tree with blue stain fungus, which disrupts the sap flow and the tree's ability to produce defensive pitch. In a healthy tree, the tree's defense mechanisms will prove to be too much of a challenge, which is why beetles normally attack older trees and help contribute to the normal cycle of the forest by removing unhealthy trees. However, with warming temperatures coupled with the California drought, forest stands are weakened, allowing bark beetle infestations to become a full-blown epidemic.
Bills have been introduced to the House of Representatives and Senate, mainly aimed at improving past acts by appropriating funds to various federal agencies. Money would be made available for salvaging timber following a catastrophic event or in an attempt to prevent one. Also, to regenerate federal forests affected by bark beetles and fire. The federal agencies and departments involved in legislation surrounding the bark beetle epidemic are the Department of Agriculture, Department and Secretary of the Interior, the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. Passed on December 3, 2003, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act directs a budget annually to the Department of the Interior and U.S. Department of Agriculture. These funds are provided for various provisions to swiftly implement hazardous fuel projects and silvicultural prescriptions to prevent catastrophes. The bill provides funding for protecting watersheds, preventing insect infestations and diseases, improving forest health and resiliency, as well as monitoring the state of public and private lands. In addition to the previous agencies mentioned, local municipalities can also be eligible for funding. House Bill 1511 is intended to improve the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003 by adding to the existing bill. Introduced on April 11, 2013, the objectives were to redirect funding normally intended for land acquisition to fund mechanical forest treatments involved in salvage operations on forest land impacted by catastrophic events, and to allow regeneration to occur, ideally within 5 years. The top priority of the bill was to treat land impacted by large-scale beetle infestations. However, the bill was transferred to different congressional committees and eventually was never passed. In 2015, an amendment to the Flame Act of 2009 was proposed. It would restructure the funding for wildfire suppression. The new Flame Fund would be available to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of the Interior. The current status quo requires federal agencies to use their existing operating budget to deal with large-scale tree mortality caused by bark beetle infestations and subsequent wildfires. The Flame Fund attempts to allocate funds for active suppression and hazardous fuel treatments. Managing the bark beetle epidemic is a specific line item within the bill. However, it was not passed. The main implication of failing to pass this bill is that the federal government refuses to appropriate money for forest and bark beetle management on a large scale. Conclusions of the status quo are that a lack of funding is prohibiting a large-scale response. Each agency must scrape together excess funds individually. There is no unified response throughout the affected government agencies. The drought and initial onset of bark beetle brought widespread media attention. However, politicians from affected states are a strong minority, and the policy window has seemingly opened and closed. So, we now have a serious problem with tree mortality. Standing dead prohibits healthy forest regeneration, and an immediate fire threat exists. However, it may lessen with time as the dead needles within the canopy fall to the forest floor. But the ecosystem services lost will persist without management, and there is a threat of the epidemic occurring again when large, even-aged stands replace those that have died off. When looking at how to move forward, the facts are clear. The problem and solutions are well documented. Legislation and funding are all that is missing. Wildfire prevention needs to be considered for emergency funding because a proactive approach is better than a reactive one. Money should come from the State of Emergency Fund. Existing federal and state agencies' budgets should not be used to treat these problems. Legislation should allow for salvaging of dead wood, even in reserves, for the goal of forest regeneration, and active management should continue into the future for the purpose of drought resistance.